The quiet hum of the exclusive restaurant Aria shattered in an instant. At her usual corner table, CEO Lyra Caldwell didn't even have time to look up from her tablet before two of her bodyguards were neutralized at the entrance. A swift, professional takedown. Three men, built like brick walls in ill-fitting suits, moved toward her, their shadows falling over her table. The patrons froze, forks hovering mid-air. The men didn't speak, they just smiled, a promise of violence. From the swinging kitchen doors, a man in a stained apron stepped out, his hands still damp. "Leave her alone," Jamal said. His deep brown hands, still damp from the dish sink, tightened slightly on the apron strings. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. The leader of the trio, a man with a roadmap of scars on his neck, turned slowly. A smirk played on his lips as he sized up the dishwasher. "Look what we have here. A knight in shining grease stains." He sneered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Go back to your plates, hero. This is private business." His two companions chuckled, a harsh, grating sound that made the other diners shrink further into their seats. They spread out slightly, flanking their leader, their movements fluid and practiced. They were a predator pack, and they had their target cornered. Jamal didn't move. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of warm brown, flickered from the leader to the other two men, then to Lyra's table. He wasn't looking at her, but at the space around her, calculating angles, noting the heavy water carafes, the polished silverware, the proximity of the serving stations. His posture was deceptively relaxed, but a coiled tension simmered just beneath the surface. "I said," Jamal repeated, his voice dropping even lower, "leave her alone." The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of annoyance. He was used to inspiring fear, not defiance, from the kitchen staff. "You've got a lot of nerve, dishwasher. You have any idea who you're talking to?" He took a step forward. "This woman has an appointment with us. Now, for the last time, get out of the way before you get hurt." Instead of backing down, Jamal took a deliberate step to his right, placing himself directly between the men and Lyra's table. He casually rested a hand on a stack of heavy, oversized ceramic dinner plates sitting on a nearby busing cart. "That's not going to happen," Jamal stated, the words hanging in the air like a final verdict. That was all the invitation the scarred man needed. With a guttural sigh of impatience, he lunged. He was fast, shockingly so for a man his size, but Jamal was faster. In a single fluid motion, he snatched the top plate from the stack and sent it spinning through the air like a discus. It wasn't aimed at the leader, but at the man to his left. The heavy plate caught the second man square in the temple with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. Before the leader could even process what had happened, Jamal had already launched a second plate. This one slammed into the third man's kneecap, eliciting a howl of pain as the joint buckled. The man stumbled, his forward momentum gone, his face a mask of shock and agony. The leader stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had expected a scuffle, a clumsy attempt at bravery. He had not expected this cold, calculated, and brutally efficient response. He looked from his two downed men to the dishwasher, who now held a third plate in his hand, his grip steady, his eyes like chips of ice. "Who the hell are you?" the leader growled, his confidence replaced by a dangerous weariness. Jamal didn't answer. He dropped the third plate, letting it shatter on the marble floor. As the leader's eyes were instinctively drawn to the sound, Jamal moved. He closed the distance between them in two long strides, grabbing a heavy cast iron pan from a tableside service cart as he went. The leader swung a clumsy, powerful fist, aiming for Jamal's head. Jamal brought the pan up, blocking the blow with a loud clang of metal on bone. The man roared in pain, shaking his bruised knuckles. Jamal didn't give him a moment to recover. He reversed his grip on the pan and slammed its flat side into the man's ribs. The air rushed out of the leader's lungs in a pained gasp. Staggering back, the scarred man reached inside his jacket, but Jamal was already there. He drove his shoulder hard into the man's chest, pinning him against a decorative column. With his free hand, Jamal grabbed the man's lapel and twisted, using the man's own momentum to spin him around and slam him face first into the pillar. The man grunted, dazed. In his desperation, he lashed out, his hand catching the thin silver chain around Jamal's neck. The chain snapped. A small metallic object flew through the air, clattering onto the floor near Lyra's table. It was a pendant, a crudely broken half of a silver dollar worn smooth with time. Jamal, a black single dad in his mid-30s, had carried that pendant for years. Lyra's world went silent. The sounds of the struggle, the gasps of the patrons, the distant wail of approaching sirens, it all faded away. Her eyes were locked on that piece of metal. It wasn't just a pendant. It was an impossibility. It was a ghost. Her breath hitched in her throat. She was no longer in a five-star restaurant. She was in a sterile hospital room 6 years ago, sitting by her father's bed. She could smell the antiseptic, feel the thin, scratchy blanket under her fingers. Her father, a man who had built an empire with his bare hands, was rendered frail by the cancer that was consuming him from the inside out. He had pressed an identical matching half of a silver dollar into her palm. His voice was a weak, papery whisper, but his eyes were filled with an urgent fire. The man who holds this piece, Lyra, he saved my life in Iraq. I was 46. He was just a kid, a medic. I was pinned down, bleeding out, and he ran through hell to get to me. I owe him everything. If you ever find him, our family's debt is his to collect. The memory struck her with the force of a physical blow. The words, "thank you," died in her throat, replaced by a wave of earth-shattering shock. This man, this dishwasher who had just dismantled 3 trained professionals with kitchenware, was the nameless, faceless hero from her father's war stories. A final, sickening thud brought her back to the present. Jamal had finished. The leader lay unconscious at the base of the column. The restaurant was a wreck of shattered plates and overturned chairs. Jamal stood, breathing heavily, not even glancing at the carnage around him. His only thought was somewhere else. He scanned the room, his eyes finally landing on a closed door at the far end of the hall, marked private. He started moving towards it, his steps urgent. Lyra finally found her voice. "Wait!" she called out, her voice trembling. "Your name? Who are you?" Jamal didn't stop. He didn't even look back. He reached the door, pushed it open, and reemerged, holding a small, dark-skinned girl with neat braids in his arms. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He held Amara tight, her face buried in his shoulder, shielding her from the scene. As he headed for the main entrance, sirens grew louder outside. Lyra stood, stumbling forward. "Please!" she cried out, her voice desperate. "I have to talk to you." But he was already gone, disappearing into the flashing red and blue lights of the arriving police cars, leaving behind a floored CEO, a defeated team of thugs, and the impossible truth of a debt that had just come due. The world rushed back in a cacophony of noise. Police officers swarmed into Arya, their voices sharp and commanding, cutting through the terrified whispers of the patrons. Paramedics followed, their movements swift as they attended to the 3 unconscious men on the floor. The flashing lights from outside painted the ruined dining room in strobing hues of red and blue, turning the scene into a surreal nightmare. Lyra stood frozen amidst the controlled chaos, her mind a whirlwind. One image eclipsed everything else: the glint of worn silver on the marble floor, the broken pendant, her father's ghost. Mains Ames Miss Caldwell. A man in a rumpled suit with tired but intelligent eyes stood before her. He held up a badge. "Detective Harding, are you injured?" Lyra blinked, pulling her gaze away from the floor. "No, I'm fine." Her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Harding asked, his pen poised over a small notepad. "My officers are getting a dozen different stories." "We know these men," he gestured to the thugs being loaded onto stretchers. "Took out your security detail. This was a targeted attack." Lyra's CEO mind, the one trained to assess threats and formulate strategy in seconds, finally began to cut through the fog of shock. She knew with absolute certainty who was responsible. "Ronan Ashworth," she said, her voice regaining its familiar steel. "We're on opposite sides of the Ethelred acquisition. He plays dirty, but I never thought we'll look into him." Harding assured her, jotting down the name. "Now, about the man who intervened, the dishwasher. Witnesses say he took these 3 men down by himself and then fled the scene. Do you know who he is?" This was the critical moment. If she told the police everything, they would launch a manhunt for him. His face would be plastered on the news. A man who had so clearly spent years building a life in the shadows would be dragged into the brightest, harshest spotlight imaginable. He would disappear so deep she'd never find him. And she had to find him. I've never seen him before. Lyra lied, her expression a carefully constructed mask of detached composure. It all happened so fast. He was just a staff member who stepped in. I imagine he was terrified and ran as soon as he could. I don't even know his name. Harding looked at her, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. He was a good detective. He could sense the evasion. But she was Lyra Caldwell, a pillar of the city's business community. He had to tread carefully. All right, Miss Caldwell, we'll get his information from the restaurant's HR. We'll need to talk to him. Of course, Lyra said smoothly. Whatever you need, detective. As Harding moved off to direct his officers, Lyra's eyes scanned the floor again. There, half hidden under the leg of an overturned chair, was the pendant. While the police were distracted, she moved quickly, her designer heel crunching softly on a piece of a shattered plate. She bent down, her fingers closing around the small, cool piece of metal. Holding it felt like holding her father's hand one last time. It was solid. It was real. This whole insane night was real. She found the restaurant manager, a man named Philip, huddled in a corner talking to a uniformed officer and looking pale. Lyra walked straight up to him. Philip, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument, I need the employee file for the dishwasher who was on duty tonight. I need it now. Miss Caldwell, the police, he stammered. The police are busy. You work for the restaurant. I am its best customer. Get me the file, she commanded, her tone dropping to an icy whisper. This is not a request. Philip scurried away. A few minutes later, he returned with a thin manila folder and handed it to her with a trembling hand. Lyra opened it. The name on the top of a sparsely filled out application form read Jamal Mitchell. There was an address that was probably years out of date and no phone number listed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a name for her father's ghost. Miles away, the city lights blurred past the grimy window of a crosstown bus. Jamal sat with his arm wrapped tightly around Amara, who was curled into his side, fast asleep. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm against his ribs. He watched her, his deep brown expression a mixture of fierce love and raw fear. The adrenaline from the fight had long since faded, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. He had broken his one cardinal rule. He had been seen for 8 years. Ever since Amara was born and her mother was gone, his entire existence had been engineered around one principle. Stay invisible, work quiet jobs, pay in cash, leave no trail. Keep his daughter safe from a world that had taught him that violence was a language everyone eventually learned to speak. Tonight, he hadn't just been seen. He had created a spectacle. He had put himself on the radar of powerful, dangerous people. People like Ronan Ashworth, a name he'd heard whispered by the chefs in the kitchen when they talked about the restaurant's most influential patrons. He knew who Lyra Caldwell was, and he knew an attack like that wasn't random. Daddy, Amara's voice was a sleepy murmur. Are we going home? Jamal stroked her hair, smoothing it back from her forehead. Yes, sweetie, we're going home. Were those bad men? She asked, her eyes still closed. Jamal's throat tightened. How could he explain the complexities of corporate warfare, of greed and ruthlessness to an 8-year-old? Yeah, he said softly. They were. But you stopped them, she said, a note of simple, unwavering faith in her voice. You were like a superhero. A bitter smile touched Jamal's lips. Not a superhero, Amara, just a guy who washes dishes. He looked back out the window. He knew they couldn't go back to their small apartment, not tonight, maybe not ever. The men who had attacked Lyra Caldwell would not take their defeat lying down. Their employer would want to know who had interfered. They would look for the dishwasher, and when they came looking, Jamal knew he couldn't protect Amara with just plates and pans. His quiet life had been shattered, and the echoes of that shattering were coming for them. Jamal held his daughter tighter. the weight of the future pressing down on him like a physical force. Lyra's penthouse was a silent sanctuary of glass and steel, suspended high above the sprawling city. The chaos of the restaurant felt a world away, yet the scent of fear and violence still clung to her clothes. She stood in the center of her cavernous living room, the city lights twinkling below like a distant galaxy. On the marble coffee table in front of her sat two objects, a thin employee file and a small broken piece of a silver dollar. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her phone. She didn't call the police. She didn't call her board of directors. She called the one man she trusted with the impossible. "Quinn," she said the moment he answered, dispensing with pleasantries. "I need you. On my way," the voice on the other end replied, calm and immediate. Quinn had been her father's head of security, and now he was hers. He was a man of few words and absolute loyalty. 15 minutes later, he stood before her, his expression unreadable as she recounted the night's events. She left out the personal connection, the story of the pendant. For now, that was hers alone. She simply framed Jamal as a brave man who had saved her life and whom she now needed to find before her enemies did. "His name is Jamal Mitchell," she said, sliding the file across the table. "The address is probably a dead end, but it's all we have. I need you to find him, Quinn. Find him, but do not approach him. Do not let him know he's been found. Just find out where he is and who he is. I need to know everything." "And Ronan Ashworth?" Quinn asked, his gaze sharp. "He'll make another move," Lyra said, her voice hard. "And when he does, I want to be ready. But first, find Jamal Mitchell." Quinn nodded once, took the file, and melted back into the night as silently as he had arrived. Alone again, Lyra walked to a discreet panel in her study wall. Behind it was a safe. From a velvet-lined box, she retrieved the other half of the silver dollar, her father's half. She brought it back to the living room and placed it on the table beside its twin. The two pieces were a perfect, jagged match. They fit together like long-lost lovers, but they were worlds apart. Her father's piece was polished, carefully preserved, a cherished heirloom. Jamal's was battered and scratched, the silver dulled from years of constant hidden wear against his skin. It was the story of their lives in two pieces of metal, one preserved in wealth and memory, the other weathered by hardship and survival. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her. She sank onto the sofa, her eyes fixed on the two halves, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. The Stardust Motel was a relic from another era, a place of peeling paint and buzzing neon on the industrial edge of the city. It was the kind of place that took cash and forgot your face the moment you closed the door. In a small, musty room, Jamal gently placed a sleeping Amara onto one of the twin beds and pulled the thin blanket over her. He stood over her for a long moment, his big black frame casting a protective shadow. He could still see the flash of fear in her eyes at the restaurant, and the sight of it had torn something open inside him. He had built his world around her safety, and tonight he had led the wolves right to their door. He moved to the small bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The man in the cracked mirror looked back at him, a stranger with tired eyes, his natural hair a tight coil of worry. He saw the faint red mark on his neck where the chain had been snapped. The pendant was gone. He felt a sharp, painful pang of loss, not for the object itself, but for the promise he had made to the man who gave it to him, a promise to live a quiet, honorable life. He returned to the main room and turned the small television on, keeping the volume barely audible. He scanned the local news channels. It didn't take long. A reporter stood in front of Arya, the flashing lights of police cars still visible behind her. The report was brief. A targeted attack on CEO Lyra Caldwell had been thwarted by the intervention of an unidentified employee who had fled the scene. The suspects were in custody. Jamal felt a flicker of surprise. She hadn't given them his name. She hadn't told them he worked there. In her position, with all that power, she could have put his face on every screen in the state. But she hadn't. Why? A memory sharp and unwelcome pierced through his thoughts. The smell of dust and cordite. The relentless Iraqi sun beating down. A captain, a man 23 years his senior with kind eyes and a photograph of his young daughter he always kept in his breast pocket. Jamal, a young black medic in a hostile land, remembered the sudden deafening explosion of an IED, the screams, his own voice, hoarse and desperate, shouting orders as he worked to stop the bleeding, his hands covered in the captain's blood. He remembered the man, Walter Caldwell, looking up at him as they airlifted him out, pressing a small, heavy object into his hand. "You live a good life, son," he'd rasped. "You live a life big enough for the both of us." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, pushing the memory away. He hadn't lived a big life. He had lived a small one. He had come home from that hell, found a woman he loved, had a daughter, and then lost the woman in a cruel, senseless accident. After that, his world had shrunk to the size of Amara's small hand in his. He wasn't a hero, he was just a survivor, and his only mission now was to make sure his daughter was one too. He knew what he had to do. Staying in the city was a death sentence. Ashworth's reach was too long. Jamal pulled an old, worn duffel bag from under the other bed. He opened the rickety closet and began packing their few belongings. Amara's favorite stuffed bear, a handful of clothes, a small tin box that held all the cash he had in the world. He worked with a quiet, practiced urgency. Every item packed was a step further away from the life they knew and a step deeper into the uncertainty of the road. His plan was simple and brutal. Run disappear so completely that no one, not Ronan Ashworth and not the mysterious CEO who held the other half of his past, could ever find them. The sun was just beginning to cast a gray, watery light over the city as Quinn pulled his nondescript sedan to a stop in front of a tired-looking apartment building. The address from Jamal Mitchell's file was, as Lyra had predicted, a dead end. The building's super, a gruff man nursing a morning coffee, confirmed that a man and his little girl, matching Jamal and Amara's description, had moved out over a year ago. "Quiet guy," the super grunted, looking Quinn over with suspicious eyes. "Always paid his rent in cash a few days early. Kept to himself. Left the place cleaner than he found it. That's all I know." For a lesser investigator, the trail would have gone cold. But Quinn operated on a different level. He knew a man like Jamal, a man who paid in cash and left no paper trail, would still have one vulnerability: a child's needs. A child needed school. Sitting in his car, Quinn worked silently on a secure laptop. Bypassing official channels, he accessed state educational databases. He cross-referenced enrollment records for every public elementary school in a 20-mile radius, searching for an Amara Mitchell, age 8. It took less than an hour. He found a match at a small, unassuming school in a working-class neighborhood across town. The emergency contact form listed a new address. When Quinn arrived at the second apartment building, he knew he was too late. A subtle tension hung in the air. He didn't enter the building. Instead, he watched from his car as two men in cheap suits, men who radiated a clumsy but palpable menace, exited, their faces tight with frustration. They weren't cops, they were hunters. Quinn recognized the type instantly. They got into a black town car and sped away. After they were gone, Quinn slipped into the building. The lock on apartment 3B had been recently forced. Inside, the small apartment was tidy but starkly empty. It felt less like a home and more like a temporary camp that had been abandoned in a hurry. A child's crayon drawing of a smiling sun was still taped to the refrigerator. On the small kitchen table, a half-eaten bowl of cereal sat next to a hastily discarded milk carton. They had left in a rush. Quinn pulled out his phone. "He's running," he told Lyra, his voice a low monotone. "And we're not the only ones looking for him." Lyra was in the middle of a tense video conference with her Tokyo office projecting an aura of absolute control. But beneath the polished boardroom table, her hand tightened on her phone. "Ronan's men, they fit the profile," Quinn confirmed. "Amateurish, but persistent. Jamal Mitchell he has a head start and he knows how to disappear, but he also has a child with him. That will slow him down." "Stay on him, Quinn," Lyra ordered, her voice dangerously quiet. "Don't lose him," she ended the call and seamlessly returned her attention to the meeting, her face an unreadable mask of corporate power, but inside a cold knot of fear was tightening in her stomach. This was no longer just about fulfilling her father's debt. It was a race to find Jamal before Ronan's thugs did. In a plush high-rise office across the city, Ronan Ashworth slammed a crystal glass down on his desk, splashing amber liquid onto a stack of legal documents. The scarred man from the restaurant stood before him, his arm in a sling, his face a patchwork of fresh bruises. "A dishwasher," Ronan repeated, his voice laced with venomous disbelief. "You and 2 other trained professionals were taken out by a man who scrapes food off plates for a living." "He wasn't just a dishwasher, Mr. Ashworth," the man mumbled, avoiding his boss's furious gaze. He moved like a soldier. He knew what he was doing. Ronan leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile spreading across his face. This was an unexpected complication, but complications could be interesting. "A soldier," he mused. "Well, find him. Find the soldier who washes dishes. Find out everything about him. I have a feeling he's going to be the key to breaking Lyra Caldwell." The bus groaned as it rumbled down the highway, leaving the city skyline behind. Amara was asleep again, her head resting on Jamal's lap. Jamal stared out at the passing landscape, his eyes scanning every car that stayed behind them for too long. Every rest stop they passed, he was a coiled spring of paranoia. "Daddy." Amara had woken up. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with confusion. "Where are we going?" "On a little trip, sweetie," he said, forcing a reassuring smile. "But what about my school project? It's due on Friday," she said, her lower lip trembling slightly. "And what about Mrs. Gable's cat? I promised I'd feed him." The simple, innocent questions felt like tiny daggers in Jamal's heart. He was ripping her away from the only life she'd ever known, from her friends, her school, her routines. He was making her a fugitive just like him. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I promise." They stopped at a grimy bus station in a small, forgotten town. 2 hours later, as they stood in line for a connecting bus heading west, Jamal felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched. He scanned the sparse crowd. His eyes landed on a man near the newsstand. He was trying to look casual, reading a paper, but his posture was all wrong. He was too tense, his shoes were too expensive for a place like this, and his eyes weren't on the newspaper. They were flicking over the crowd, methodically searching. Jamal's blood ran cold. It could be a coincidence. It could be his paranoia getting the best of him. But in his old life, ignoring a feeling like that was how you got killed. Without a word, he took Amara's hand. "Change of plans, sweetie," he whispered, his voice calm but urgent. "Let's go get a snack." He didn't look back. He walked them calmly away from the ticket counter, past the restrooms, and straight toward a side exit marked "Employees Only." He pushed the door open and they slipped out into a back alley smelling of stale grease and rain. He led Amara down the alley and onto a different street, his heart hammering against his ribs. A few minutes later they were on another bus, this one a local line heading north instead of west. As the bus pulled away, Jamal looked back at the station. The man in the expensive shoes was now standing out front, looking around in frantic confusion. It hadn't been paranoia. They were being hunted. Jamal settled back into his seat, pulling Amara close. He had bought them a little more time. But as the bus carried them deeper into the unknown, he was acutely aware that he was no longer just running from something. He was now running against 2 unseen forces, one that wanted to find him and another that wanted to destroy him. And he had no idea which one would catch up to him first. The man in the expensive shoes stood in the grimy bus station alley, his phone pressed to his ear. "He's gone," he said, his voice tight with the fear of reporting failure. "He spotted me, vanished." On the other end of the line, in his pristine office, Ronan Ashworth listened, his knuckles white as he gripped a silver letter opener. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. His silence was more terrifying than any threat. "So," Ronan finally said, his voice a silky, dangerous purr. "The rabbit is not only fast, he's clever. This is becoming more entertaining than I anticipated." He hung up the phone and swiveled his chair to face a different man, a technician sitting at a temporary computer terminal, humming quietly in the corner. "Forget the physical approach for now. It's too clumsy. I want a digital dragnet. Hire the best data miners money can buy. I want to know every time the name Jamal Mitchell or Amara Mitchell is used anywhere on the internet." Credit card applications, pharmacy records, social media mentions, DMV searches. I want to know if he so much as Googles the price of a bus ticket. This man is a ghost. Fine, let's see how long a ghost can survive in the modern world. Back in Lyra's penthouse, a similar strategic shift was underway. Quinn stood before a large interactive map of the northeastern United States, his expression grim. He's gone completely dark, Lyra. No phone, no credit cards, no digital trail of any kind. He's either a ghost or he's been taught by them. Lyra paced in front of the window, the two halves of the pendant sitting on her desk like a silent challenge. Frustration gnawed at her. She was a woman who could bend global markets to her will, but she couldn't find one man. So, we just wait. We wait for Ronan's men to stumble upon him. A man like Mitchell isn't stumbling, Quinn said. He's moving with purpose. The problem is we're thinking like us. We're looking for him in our world. We need to start thinking like him. Lyra stopped pacing, her gaze falling on the pendant. She remembered a story her father had told her years ago after a business deal had gone sour and he'd had to retreat to their old family lake house. Sometimes, Lyra, he'd said, when the jungle is full of predators, you don't run to a different part of the jungle. You climb the tallest, loneliest tree you can find so you can see them coming long before they see you. A thought sparked in her mind. He's not running aimlessly, she said, her voice filled with newfound certainty. He's running to somewhere, a place where he can see trouble coming. She turned to Quinn, her eyes alight. Stop looking for where he is. Start looking for where he's from. Dig into his military service. Find out who his friends were, where his unit was based. Did his family own any property? An old hunting cabin? A forgotten piece of land? Stop chasing his shadow, Quinn. Find his roots. 300M north, the bus finally hissed to a stop in a town called Havenwood. It wasn't so much a town as a single main street carved into a dense, endless forest of pine and maple. The air was crisp and clean, a world away from the city's smog. This was the kind of place people came to lose themselves. Jamal led Amara off the bus, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with a quiet purpose, his eyes taking in the layout of the small town, the single grocery store, the diner, the hardware shop. He found what he was looking for at the end of the street, a small hand-painted sign that read, "Cabins for rent, weekly, monthly." The owner was a wiry old man named Silas with a face like a road map and hands like gnarled oak. He looked Jamal and Amara up and down, his gaze lingering on the exhaustion in Jamal's eyes. He didn't ask for ID, or he didn't ask for a credit card. He just took the wad of cash Jamal offered him and handed over a rusty key. "Cabin 4, Silas said, pointing up a dirt track that disappeared into the woods. "Wood stove for heat, well for water. Don't cause trouble." The cabin was little more than a single room with a small kitchen and a loft for sleeping, but it was clean. And, most importantly, it was isolated. It was defensible. For the first time in days, Jamal felt a sliver of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Amara, seeing the woods and the small creek burbling nearby, forgot her fear and her sadness. To her, this was a grand adventure. "Can we build a fort, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "We sure can, sweetie," Jamal said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time since the night at Arya. For a few days, they found a fragile peace. They built a fort out of fallen branches. They skipped stones in the creek. Jamal taught her how to identify different bird calls. He tried to build a small bubble of normalcy for her, a fortress of fatherly love against the darkness he knew was circling. But every night after she was asleep in the loft, he would walk the perimeter of the cabin, checking sightlines, listening to the sounds of the forest, his soldier's mind never truly at rest. The peace was shattered on the 5th morning. Jamal was making pancakes when he glanced at the small orange prescription bottle sitting on the counter. Amara's heart medication. He opened the cap and tipped the contents into his palm. There were only 4 pills left. A cold dread, more potent than any fear of Ronan Ashworth's thugs, seized him. The bottle was empty. 4 pills, 2 days. He had run from the city, from the hunters, from his past. He had found a sanctuary in the middle of nowhere, but he had run himself straight into a different kind of trap. He could hide from Ronan's men. He could hide from Lyra Caldwell, but he couldn't hide from his daughter's illness. To get a refill, he would need a doctor's visit, a new prescription sent to a local pharmacy. He would have to use his real name. He would have to create a paper trail. He would have to step out of the shadows and announce his presence to the world. He looked at the 4 small pills in his hand, then up at the loft where his daughter was sleeping peacefully. He had escaped one hunt only to be cornered by a far more relentless one, time. The 4 small pills on the cabin's rough-hewn table felt like a death sentence. Jamal stared at them, his mind racing through a dozen desperate, dangerous scenarios. The local clinic in Havenwood was out of the question. In a town this small, a stranger asking for a specialized pediatric heart medication would become the subject of gossip before he even left the parking lot. Anonymity was his only shield, and in Havenwood, he had none. He had to move, not run, not again. He had to make a surgical strike into the world he'd abandoned. He found a map at the town's small gas station. A city, Northwood, was a 40-mile drive away. It was big enough to have an emergency room, multiple pharmacies, and a population that wouldn't look twice at a new face. It was his best and only shot. Jamal knelt beside Amara, who was busy drawing a picture of a family of bears in front of their cabin. "Hey, sweetie," he said, forcing his voice to sound light. "Daddy has to go to a bigger town to get some supplies. It's a bit of a drive. I need you to be a brave big girl and stay here and hold down the fort. Can you do that for me?" She looked up, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. She was only 8, but she had her father's observant eyes. She could sense the tension humming beneath his calm exterior. "Will you be back for dinner?" she asked, her voice small. "I'll be back before you know it," he promised, kissing her forehead. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. Understand?" She nodded solemnly. "Be safe, Daddy." The words echoed in his ears as he drove away in the beat-up pickup truck he'd bought from Silas. Every mile he put between himself and the cabin felt like a mile of his daughter's safety, unraveling. In her penthouse, Lyra was looking at a different kind of map. Quinn had spent the last 2 days buried in archives, and he'd finally found a crack in Jamal Mitchell's wall of anonymity. His military file is heavily redacted, Quinn explained, pointing to a highlighted section on a screen. "But I found this, a commendation letter written and filed by your father." Lyra leaned closer. Her father's signature was a familiar, painful sight, Quinn continued. "Walter praises Mitchell's bravery during an ambush, but it's this part that matters. He mentions Mitchell's unique value to the unit, citing his background growing up in the rugged Appalachian wilderness of Pennsylvania and his preternatural tracking and survival skills. He wasn't just a medic, he was their guide." Quinn swiped the screen and a topographical map of Pennsylvania replaced the document. He circled a large, dense region of mountains and forests. "If I were him and I needed to disappear, this is where I'd go. Back to the terrain I know better than anyone." He began to zoom in, highlighting small, isolated towns nestled deep in the green expanse. Towns with names like Hemlock Creek, Stone Valley, and Havenwood. "It's a long shot," Quinn admitted, "but it's the first lead that feels right." "Go there," Lyra said without hesitation. "Start with Havenwood. But Quinn, be careful. If he even thinks he's being followed, he will vanish. And this time, we'll never find him. Observe only." The urgent care clinic in Northwood was a chaotic symphony of coughs, crying children, and the monotonous drone of a daytime television show. It was perfectly, blessedly anonymous. Jamal filled out the paperwork, his hands steady, but his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He used his real name and handed over the tattered copy of Amara's medical records he always carried with him. He was just another worried father in a room full of them. The doctor was young, overworked, and barely looked up from his chart. He glanced at the records, asked a few perfunctory questions, and wrote out a new prescription. "You can get this filled at any pharmacy," he said, already moving toward the next patient. Jamal felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. He had the prescription. The first most dangerous part was over. He chose the largest, busiest pharmacy he could find, a brightly lit chain store attached to a massive supermarket. He walked to the back and handed the slip of paper to the pharmacist, a woman with a kind, tired face. "This will be about 20 minutes, she said with a sympathetic smile. Jamal nodded and walked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. It had worked. He had walked into the fire and emerged unscathed. He wandered the aisles of the supermarket, picking up some of Amara's favorite snacks, feeling like a normal father for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Back at the pharmacy counter, the pharmacist typed the information into her computer. Name, Amara Mitchell. Medication, a specialized beta blocker. Doctor, Urgent Care Clinic, Northwood. As she clicked enter, the information was processed, cross-referenced with insurance databases, and logged in a national pharmaceutical network. A tiny, invisible ripple of data spread out from her terminal. In a darkened room hundreds of miles away, that ripple hit a tripwire. Ronan Ashworth's data mining operation, which had been silently scanning billions of bytes of digital traffic, suddenly came to life. An algorithm searching for the specific combination of Amara Mitchell and any medical activity found a match. An alarm, a quiet but insistent chime, echoed through the room. A young technician stared at his screen, his eyes wide. He turned to his supervisor. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "we've got a hit." He pointed to the flashing red line on his monitor. Prescription filled, patient name Amara Mitchell. Pharmacy location, Northwood, Pennsylvania. He quickly pulled up a map. "It's a small city, sir, located just 40 miles west of a remote mountain town called Havenwood." At that exact moment, Jamal was walking out of the pharmacy and into the late afternoon sun. He clutched the small white paper bag in his hand. Inside was the medicine that would keep his daughter alive. A profound sense of relief washed over him. He'd done it. He'd beaten the odds. The invisible weight of being a black man on the run had just gotten heavier. He started the long drive back to the cabin, back to his daughter, believing he was heading back to the safety of his sanctuary. He had no idea that the net he never even knew existed had just been pulled tight, and the hunters now knew exactly where to find him. The confirmation of Jamal's location lit a predatory fire in Ronan Ashworth's eyes. He swiveled in his leather chair to face a man who had been standing silently in the corner of his office. This man was the antithesis of the bruised thugs from the restaurant. He was lean, disciplined, and his stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. His name was Kreese. "Our rabbit has found a hole in the mountains near a town called Havenwood," Ronan said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "A man who thinks the wilderness can protect him from the power of a boardroom. He has a daughter with him. Her name is Amara. She is his weakness." Kreese remained silent, his eyes fixed on his employer. "I want the girl," Ronan continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She will be my leverage against Lyra Caldwell. As for the father, he's proven to be resourceful. Make him compliant." If he resists, Ronan paused, picking up the silver letter opener and idly testing its point against his thumb. "Dispose of him. I want this handled quietly and professionally. No mistakes this time." Kreese gave a single sharp nod, turned and walked from the room, leaving no doubt that the mission would be executed with brutal efficiency. Back at the cabin, the afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating a scene of peaceful domesticity. Jamal had returned. The small white bag from the pharmacy sat on the counter, a symbol of a crisis averted. Amara chattered happily as she ate the chocolate bar he'd brought her, telling him all about the squirrels she'd made friends with while he was gone. For a few precious hours, Jamal allowed himself to believe they were safe. The fear that had been his constant companion for days receded, replaced by the simple, profound joy of watching his daughter laugh. The remote wilderness felt like a fortress, its ancient trees standing guard over their small sanctuary. At that same moment, a dusty pickup truck that looked like it belonged to a local fisherman rolled into Havenwood. At the wheel, Quinn looked nothing like a high-level security operative. In a faded flannel shirt and a baseball cap, he blended in perfectly. He parked near the general store and went inside, buying a coffee and a local newspaper. He didn't ask questions, he listened. It didn't take long. Small towns run on gossip. He overheard the store owner talking to a customer about the newcomer who'd rented Silas's old cabin. Just him and a little girl. Pays in cash. Keeps to himself. Seems decent enough, I suppose. Quinn finished his coffee, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Lyra's hunch had been right. He got back in his truck and drove slowly toward the dirt track that led up into the woods, parking a discreet distance away before continuing on foot. He moved through the forest with a practiced silence, finding a high vantage point that gave him a clear, concealed view of Cabin 4. He saw the smoke curling from the chimney. He saw the silhouette of a man and a child moving inside. He settled in to observe just as he'd been ordered. As dusk began to settle over the forest, a profound and unnatural quiet fell. The chirping of the crickets ceased. The birds went silent. It was a silence Jamal knew all too well. It was the silence of a hunter stalking its prey. Jamal was on his feet in an instant, his body rigid with tension. He moved to the window, peering through a tiny gap in the curtains. The woods were dark, a wall of impenetrable shadow, but he could feel it. They were out there. "Amara," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper that cut through the quiet cabin. "Wake up, sweetie. We're going to play a game." The quiet game. "Okay. You have to be very, very still and do exactly what I say." Amara's sleepy eyes fluttered open, widening with fear, as she saw the look on her father's face. She nodded, her small body trembling. Jamal swiftly helped her put on her shoes and jacket. He grabbed his duffel bag, the one that was always kept packed, and slung it over his shoulder. He was moving toward the back door, a pre-planned escape route that led deeper into the woods when he heard it. The faint but unmistakable crunch of a boot on a dry twig just outside the front of the cabin. They were close, too close. From his perch on the ridge, Quinn watched in horror through a pair of night vision binoculars. A team of 4 men, clad in black tactical gear and armed with suppressed rifles, was moving in on the cabin. They moved with a silent, deadly grace of professionals. This wasn't a clumsy intimidation tactic. This was an abduction or an execution. His orders were clear. Observe only. Making contact could ruin everything Lyra was trying to build. It could destroy any chance of gaining Jamal's trust. But as he watched the lead operative reach the cabin door, preparing to breach, the image of the small child's drawing on Jamal's empty refrigerator flashed in his mind. His duty warred with his conscience. His loyalty to Lyra warred with the basic human instinct to protect an innocent child from monsters. Inside the cabin, Jamal pushed Amara behind him, his hand grabbing the heaviest thing he could find, the cast iron skillet from the stove. He was a soldier, but he was armed with nothing but kitchenware against a team of trained killers. Jamal stood between his daughter and the door, his body a human shield, his heart pounding a frantic drumbeat of terror and resolve. Outside, the lead operative raised his hand, signaling the breach. On the ridge, Quinn raised his rifle, the cabin's front door centered in his crosshairs. He had seconds to make a choice that would change everything. The forest held its breath, waiting for the first shot. The forest's breath was a silent, frozen prayer. Inside the cabin, Jamal braced for the splintering crash of the door. On the ridge, Quinn's finger tightened on the trigger. The operative in the lead, Kreese, gave the silent signal to breach. In that sliver of a second before the world exploded, Quinn made his choice. A single deafening crack echoed through the mountains. It wasn't the sound of a door breaking. It was the sharp, authoritative report of a high-powered sniper rifle. A plume of sparks erupted from the cabin's metal doorknob, which disintegrated into a shower of shrapnel. Kreese's hand, which had been reaching for the handle, was violently knocked back. Chaos. Kreese and his team reacted instantly, their professional training taking over. They dove for the cover of the dense trees, shouting reports into their comms. Contact, sniper, unknown position. They were expecting a cornered rabbit, not a tiger on the ridge. For Jamal, the sound of that rifle was a thunderclap of violent opportunity. Jamal didn't know who was firing or why, but he knew a God-sent distraction when he heard one. "Now, Amara," he whispered, and in one swift motion, he used the skillet to shatter the rear window of the cabin. He bundled his daughter through the opening, shielding her head with his arm before tumbling out after her into the cold, dark woods. He didn't look back. Jamal scooped Amara into his arms and ran, melting into the familiar protective darkness of the forest. His feet bare of any boot, barely made a sound on the pine needles. He was a ghost in his own element. The firefight erupted. Kreese, realizing his primary target was escaping, made a quick decision. "Two of you after them," he barked into his mic. "The girl is the primary objective. The rest, suppress that sniper." Muzzle flashes began to stitch the darkness as two of Ronan's men broke off, plunging into the woods after Jamal, while the other two laid down a hail of fire toward the ridge. Quinn was already moving. He fired another shot, this one taking out a small transformer on a nearby utility pole, plunging the immediate area into absolute blackness. Then he slid back from his perch, melting into the trees. He was a phantom, his purpose not to eliminate the enemy but to herd them, to harass them, to slow them down just enough to give Jamal a fighting chance. He was a sheepdog nipping at the heels of wolves. As Jamal fled, his father's blood, his grandfather's blood, the blood of generations of men who knew these mountains, sang in his veins. He scrambled down a steep embankment, using a shallow creek to mask his tracks. The freezing water, a shocking jolt to his system. He held Amara tight, her small body trembling with cold and fear, her face buried in his neck. He whispered reassurances to her, his voice a low, calming rumble against the sporadic sound of gunfire behind them. In her penthouse, Lyra was staring at her phone, her heart a block of ice in her chest. Quinn hadn't checked in. His scheduled 10-minute update was 5 minutes late. Then the phone buzzed, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. She snatched it up. "Quinn, they're here," he said, his voice tense, the sound of his own ragged breathing and distant gunshots echoing down the line. "Ronan's men, professionals. They went for the cabin. I had to engage. Jamal and the girl are on the run, heading east into the park preserve." The floor seemed to drop out from under Lyra. Her carefully constructed plan, her quiet, discreet search. It was all in ruins, replaced by a live fire conflict in the middle of nowhere. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm fine for now," he said, "but they're being hunted, Lyra. I can slow them down, but I can't stop them all." Not alone. A fire ignited in Lyra's gut, burning away the last of her fear and replacing it with a cold, hard rage. She was done waiting. She was done observing. These were her father's people. They were her people. "Your orders have changed," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that would have made her father proud. "Keep them alive. Whatever it takes, I'm on my way." She hung up before Quinn could reply. She strode to her closet, past the rows of designer dresses and suits, and pulled out a pair of rugged jeans and hiking boots she hadn't worn in years. She grabbed her car keys and the two halves of the silver pendant from her desk. She was no longer a CEO watching from a glass tower. She was the daughter of Walter Caldwell, and she was going to war. Deep in the woods, Jamal had finally put some distance between himself and his pursuers. He found a small rock outcropping, a shallow overhang that offered minimal but welcome cover. He slid to the ground, pulling Amara into his lap, wrapping her in his own jacket. "It's okay, sweetie," he murmured, his voice. "It's okay. We're safe for now." He tried to make sense of the chaos. Who was the shooter on the ridge? An enemy of Ronan Ashworth, a cop who had stumbled upon the scene. He had no answers. He was adrift in a sea of violence. His only compass the need to protect the small, shivering child in his arms. Meanwhile, Kreese had regrouped with one of his men near the now empty cabin. He knew they had underestimated this black man. The sniper had vanished. His other two men were still in the woods chasing shadows. He was furious. His clean, simple operation had devolved into a chaotic mess. He keyed his comm. "All teams, new directive," he said, his voice like ice. "The father is a secondary target. He is a distraction. The client wants the girl. Find her. Take her. And if you have to, burn this forest to the ground." The night was a labyrinth of tangled roots and grasping branches. Jamal moved through it with a desperate animal grace. Amara clinging to his back, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck, Every snap twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like the footfalls of the men who were hunting them. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial escape was starting to wane, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Amara was shivering, not just from the cold, but from terror. He couldn't keep this up. Running wasn't a plan. It was a slow-motion surrender. He needed a fortress. From the depths of his memory, an image surfaced, an old abandoned fire tower on top of Eagle's Peak, the highest point for miles. It was a relic built of stone and steel, a place his own grandfather had taken him as a boy. It was defensible. It had a view of every approach. It was their only chance. Unseen, 100 yards behind them, Quinn moved like a ghost. He was their guardian angel, a silent shepherd guiding his flock by culling the wolves. He didn't engage the two pursuers directly. He harassed them, a carefully thrown rock to create a sound in the opposite direction. A branch dislodged from a high tree that crashed down in their path. He was a master of misdirection, turning the forest itself into an ally, playing on the hunter's city-bred nerves and slowing their progress to a crawl. Miles away, the tires of a high-performance sedan hummed over the dark asphalt of a rural highway. Lyra drove with a focused intensity, the city a distant memory in her rearview mirror. The world outside her car was pitch black, a far cry from the perpetual twilight of her penthouse. She was on the phone with Quinn, the connection crackling in and out. Two of them still on his trail, Quinn's voice reported, strained. He's heading for high ground, Eagle's Peak. I'm less than an hour out, Lyra said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The two halves of the pendant lay on the passenger seat, glinting in the faint light of the dashboard. They felt less like a debt and more like a promise. Just keep them safe, Quinn. Get them to that tower. The chase was a grueling, uphill battle. Jamal could hear the men behind them now, crashing through the underbrush, their frustration making them clumsy. They were closing the distance. The stone foundation of the fire tower finally appeared through the trees, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Almost there, sweetie, Jamal whispered, his lungs burning. He reached the base of the tower and scrambled up the first flight of rusted metal stairs. The two hunters burst through the tree line, rifles raised. The first shot pinged off the steel staircase, inches from Jamal's leg. He deposited Amara in the relative safety of the tower's enclosed upper room. Stay down no matter what you hear, he commanded, his voice raw. He turned to face his pursuers, armed with nothing but a thick piece of fallen lumber he'd grabbed on his way up. The first man started up the stairs, his movements confident. Jamal waited until he was halfway up, then heaved the heavy piece of wood down with all his strength. The man cried out in surprise as the makeshift battering ram slammed into him, sending him tumbling back down to the ground in a heap. The second man was smarter. He stayed at the base, firing up at the cabin, forcing Jamal to take cover. The plan was simple: pin him down until his partner recovered. But they had forgotten about the ghost on the ridge. From the shadows of the forest, Quinn emerged. He moved with a brutal, silent efficiency. The second hunter, so focused on the tower, never even heard him coming. Quinn disarmed him with a series of swift, precise strikes, ending with a chokehold that left the man unconscious on the ground. The first hunter, just beginning to stir, met a similar fate. The entire confrontation was over in less than 10 seconds. Up in the tower, the shooting stopped. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the noise. Jamal peered down from the catwalk, his heart pounding. He saw the two hunters lying motionless on the ground, and he saw a third man standing over them, the man from the ridge, his savior. Slowly, the man looked up, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a soldier. He was something else. Jamal held his ground as the man began to climb the stairs, his movements steady and non-threatening. When he reached the top, he stopped a respectful distance away. He wasn't even breathing heavily. "Who are you?" Jamal demanded, his voice a low growl, his grip on his makeshift club still tight. The man looked from Jamal's fierce protective stance to the closed door of the cabin where he knew the child was hiding. "You're a hard man to find, Mitchell," he said, his voice calm and even. "That's the point," Jamal shot back. "You've been following me. You fired that shot at the cabin. Who are you working for?" Quinn didn't raise his hands. He didn't make any sudden moves. He simply reached into his jacket pocket. Jamal tensed, ready for a weapon. But what Quinn pulled out was a phone. He tapped the screen and it lit up with a photograph. It was a picture of the two broken halves of the silver pendant lying side by side. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the image, his mind struggling to comprehend. "My name is Quinn," the man said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "I work for Lyra Caldwell. She sent me to find you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She's on her way here now." The makeshift club slipped from Jamal's numb fingers, clattering onto the metal catwalk. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The woman he had saved, the daughter of the man he had saved in another lifetime. She hadn't just protected his identity from the police. She had sent a guardian angel to watch over him. The hunters below were not hers. They were someone else's. He looked from the phone to Quinn's impassive face, and then out into the vast, dark wilderness. He had been running from a ghost, only to be rescued by a memory. He wasn't sure if he was saved, or if he had just run headlong into a different, more complicated kind of trap. The silence on top of the fire tower was a fragile truce. Jamal stared at Quinn, then at the phone in his hand, the image of the two pendants burning itself into his mind. He was a man adrift, the solid ground of his reality having crumbled away beneath him. From the tower's small cabin, the door creaked open. Amara peeked out, her small face pale in the moonlight. Seeing that the immediate danger had passed, she ran to her father, wrapping her arms around his legs and burying her face against him. Jamal's hand came to rest on her head, a protective, grounding gesture. "Why?" Jamal asked, his voice rough with emotion, his eyes still locked on Quinn. "Why would she do all this?" "It's about a debt," Quinn answered simply. "One she feels is long overdue." As if summoned by his words, a new sound drifted up from the base of the mountain, the crunch of tires on the dirt track. A few minutes later, a figure emerged from the tree line and began to climb the metal stairs. It was Lyra. She looked out of place in her rugged clothes, yet she climbed with an unshakable determination. When she reached the top, her eyes met Jamal's. All the power, all the corporate armor she wore like a second skin was gone. In her eyes, Jamal saw not a billionaire CEO, but the grieving daughter of a man he once knew. She stopped before him, her gaze falling to the small girl clinging to his side. Her expression softened. Then she held out her hand. In her palm lay the two halves of the silver dollar. "This is yours, I believe," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She offered him his battered half. "My father told me what you did. He never forgot. Neither did I." Jamal looked at the piece of metal but didn't take it. "I want to settle the debt," Lyra continued, falling back on the language she knew best, the language of transactions. "I'll give you anything you want, a house, money, a new life, anywhere in the world. You and Amara will never have to worry about anything again. Just name it." It was the offer of a lifetime. It was the solution to every problem that had haunted him for years, and he refused it. "I don't want your money," Jamal said, his voice quiet but firm. He finally looked her directly in the eye. "Your father was a good man, a brave man. What I did for him, it was my duty. There was no debt." He pulled Amara closer. "This is my life. This is all I want. I don't want your world." His words struck Lyra with more force than any physical blow. She finally understood. The debt her father spoke of wasn't financial. It couldn't be settled with a wire transfer. It was a debt of honor, of family, of life itself. Her father hadn't wanted her to pay Jamal off. He had wanted her to understand the value of a man who would risk everything for a stranger, to recognize that kind of worth and to protect it. "You're right," she whispered, her throat tight. "But my world isn't done with you." Quinn stepped forward. "She's right, Mitchell. Ronan Ashworth now knows who you are. The men we took down tonight are just pawns. He will send more. He will not stop until he has what he wants. And what he wants is leverage against Lyra. He wants your daughter, Amara." The cold, hard truth of it settled over Jamal. He could run, but for how long? He could hide, but could he ever truly keep Amara safe from a man with limitless resources and no conscience? Running wasn't a life. It was a cage. Lyra looked at him, her expression shifting from one of gratitude to one of fierce partnership. "You said you don't want my world," she said, her voice ringing with new strength. "But Ronan Ashworth has dragged you into it. You can't protect Amara from him alone, and I can't fight him without someone I can truly trust." She took a step closer. "Help me stop him," she urged. "Not for a debt, not for money, for our families, for your daughter's future. The best way to disappear is to eliminate the person who's looking for you." Jamal looked down at his daughter. He saw her terrified eyes in the cabin, her shivering form in the cold creek, her small hand clutching his as they ran. Lyra was right. The only way to stop running was to stop the hunter. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The war that followed was not fought with guns in a forest, but with data, strategy, and relentless pressure in the glass towers of the city. With Jamal's tactical mind planning their every move, Quinn's flawless execution, and Lyra's immense resources, they turned the tables on Ronan Ashworth. They didn't just defend, they attacked. They leaked evidence of his corporate espionage to the press, provided anonymous tips to federal investigators about his financial crimes, and systematically dismantled his empire from the inside out. 3 months later, Ronan Ashworth was arrested, his company in ruins, his name a permanent stain. The threat was over. 6 months after that, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over a city park. Amara, now 9 years old, laughed as she flew down a slide, her deep brown cheeks rosy with health. She was enrolled in the best school in the city, her heart condition managed by the best doctors. She lived in a world without shadows. At a nearby bench, Jamal watched her, a relaxed, easy smile on his face. He no longer looked over his shoulder. He, the former black medic, was the head of Lyra Caldwell's personal and corporate security, a title he had accepted on his own terms with weekends off, and a strict rule that he was never to miss a school play or a parent-teacher conference. Lyra sat beside him, not as a client, but as a friend, a family. They weren't a couple, not in the traditional sense. They were something quieter, stronger. They were two survivors who had found a common harbor. "She seems happy," Lyra said softly. "We both are," Jamal replied, his gratitude a quiet, constant presence between them. In Lyra's office on the highest floor of the Caldwell Tower, a small object sat on her desk, displayed in a simple glass case. A silversmith had meticulously fused the two broken halves of the silver dollar back together. The jagged seam was still visible, a reminder of the two different worlds that had violently collided and the unbreakable bond that had been forged in the fire. If you're hearing this, it means you stayed to the very end. Thank you. That honestly means the world to me. I really hope you got something out of it. Maybe a new way of looking at things, a moment of peace, or just a good escape from the everyday. If you did, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. You see, we're on a mission here to prove that deep, meaningful stories still have a place in this world. When you subscribe, it's like you're telling us, keep going. When you hit that like button, you're giving the story a little push so it can find the next person who might need it. Don't forget those notifications so you know when the next one is ready. From me to you, thank you for being here.